I made Ben carry wet clay from the bank while the sun was still high, and I wrote each load in my worn ledger by weight. If the spring turned hard before a merchant crossed Blacktooth Pass, our butter would spoil in the dark, and the salt and lead would not come. When the old spring box split and one crock turned sour at the edge, I stopped speaking of patching and started laying stone. The water still ran cold under my hand, but the mountain was already making up its mind. August 1838. Kettle Run sat in the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky, green on top and damp in the hollow. Margaret Hale and her grandson Ben lived in a one-room log cabin above a narrow spring. The roof leaked at one seam. The north wall breathed cold, even in summer. Margaret was 63. Ben was 9. She kept the fire, the hens, the mending, and the counts. He fetched water, carried loads, and watched her hands before he asked questions. They lived on eggs, butter, cornmeal, and what she could trade before roads went bad. If the spring froze before a merchant crossed Blacktooth Pass, their butter and eggs would spoil, and they would lose the salt and lead that kept them through winter. On the 8th morning of August, the old plank spring box split at the lid seam. Flies got under the rag cover. One butter crock smelled sour at the edge. A second lid sagged and dropped a corner into the water. Margaret set both crocks on the bench and looked toward the ridge. People in Kettle Run said Blacktooth could close early when cold came down wrong. Ben asked if they could patch the box. She tested the wood with a nail. Rot came up under the point. No patch would hold cold weather. Before breakfast, she opened a worn ledger and wrote the date. She wrote, 2 eggs cracked, butter sour at North Box. Ben knew that ledger. His mother left in 1836 after his father's death and never sent a word back. His father had been crushed under a timber roll and then lost to fever. Since then, Ben belonged to Margaret's roof, rules, and pencil marks. She wrote one more line and said it aloud for him to hear. 38 days by her count, before the first frost she trusted. 11 pounds of salt in the keg, less than 1 pound of lead in a cloth twist. 13 miles to town, longer with a load. By first light next day, Margaret was at the spring with stakes, a shovel, and a measuring stick. Ben came behind her with the iron pan and an empty feed sack. Mist sat low over the water. She drove the stick into the bank and marked the depth with her thumb. Then she told him plain they were not mending a box. They were building a stone-lined spring house. Clay-sealed walls, raised shelves, a vent slid under the eave, an earth berm packed against the north side. He stared at the wet ground and said it looked too small. Margaret said small was fine if it stayed cold and stayed clean. She marked where the channel must run. Next, she marked where no one should step. Then she showed him the spring mouth and said that flow was the whole winter in one narrow sound. By mid-morning, she had him carrying wet clay from the cut bank below the walnut. The clay came up heavy and slick. He hauled it in the iron pan until his wrists shook. Then she switched him to a half-barrel drag so the weight rode lower. Each load she judged in her hands and called a number. He repeated the number back. At noon, she checked his palms for split skin. None yet. That evening, she wrote the first work line in the ledger. August 9th. Ben hauled clay, 14 pans, near 168 pounds by guess. She underlined the number twice. The third day opened with rain before dawn. The slope turned to soap. Margaret set a plank skid in the path and told Ben no running and no high loads. She made him repeat the rule. A slip in that trench could break a leg. Rain slumped one side of the clay cut. Richer clay came with it. More mess, too. By first light, she was tamping stone at the base course while Ben dragged the pan up the skid. He asked if they could stop when the rain stopped. Margaret said they would stop when the wall reached her knee. That was how she answered most things. Measure first, feeling after. At mid-morning, Amos Hale rode up on a roan mule and stayed mounted. He was her late son-in-law's brother. Loud before noon, quick to claim what was not yet his. He looked at Ben in the mud and said she was working the boy like hired help. He looked at the spring and said the lower strip would come to him after harvest anyway. Margaret kept packing clay between stones while he talked. Then she asked if he had brought a writ. Amos laughed and said she was too old to talk paper, said she could cut ties for his crew or let him take the spring and give her a share. Ben watched her hands. Margaret stood up slow, clay to the wrists, and said the spring fed her roof and the boy's stomach. She told Amos to bring paper if he wanted anything else. He spat near a stake and called the wall foolish. After he rode off, and Ben asked if they would be turned out, Margaret reset the kicked stake and said eviction starts with fear and ends with signatures. No signatures. Carry clay. At noon she washed up and wrote another proof line. August 11th, Amos came. No paper. 2 days later, the wall reached her knee. She let Ben sit and scrape dried mud from the pan rim while she laid flat stone for the floor. Every gap wide enough for a mouse got packed. Every edge that could tip a crock got reset. At 4 o'clock, she poured 2 pails across the floor to test the run. Water pooled in the back left corner. Freeze pocket, she said. Then she broke up half a day's work with a chisel and lowered that corner. Ben groaned when she pulled stones they had already set. Margaret said, a wrong floor. Steals food all winter and does not care who is tired in August. That night, she patched Ben's shirt shoulder with a square from an old flour sack. The sack still showed a faded merchant stamp. J. Tull and Company. Hazard. Superfine. She counted stitches aloud while Ben held the lamp. 16 overcast. 12 cross at the corner. The stitch count went into the ledger beside the clay weights. He asked why she wrote mending like trade. Margaret said, winter forgets nothing, so she wrote first. Next morning, she found the cabin stovepipe collar split where rust had eaten the seam. Cold weather would punish that too. She cut a tin patch from a lard can and fixed it after dinner. Then she wrote a scrap note and pinned it under the lamp. Pipe collar split. Tin patch. Done 1:20 after dinner. By the second week of August, the spring house walls stood at Margaret's waist. She gave Ben lighter loads and more trips. Heavy loads bent him wrong. Many small loads taught pace. The ledger showed the change. August 15th. Ben hauled clay, 21 pans, near 147 pounds. August 16. Ben hauled clay, 18 pans, near 132 pounds. On the 17th, a hen got into the trench and broke 2 eggs against the stone edge. Ben cursed under his breath with a word he learned from Amos. Margaret snapped her head up and made him say the loss plain instead. So he said it. 2 eggs lost. Then he cleaned shell from the seam before the smell set. By mid-morning, she left a vent slit under the back eave and showed him where cold must breathe. Cold without breath turns wet, she said. Wet rots. What cold was meant to save? He touched the vent with 2 fingers, like he was checking a pulse. Around noon, Miss Eliza Boone came from down Kettle Run with a basket of beans and a face ready for talk. She looked over the wall and said, folks were laughing in town. Said Amos had been telling people the place would come to him by frost. Then she handed Margaret a folded store chit from J. Tull and Company that came by rider. It listed salt, lamp oil, and lead with last spring prices scratched out and higher ones penciled in. At the bottom, in a sharp hand, it read, rates subject to past delay and spoil risk. Margaret read that line twice. She folded the chit smaller and tucked it in the ledger. Ben asked if Mr. Tull was mad. Margaret said no. He was early. That was worse. The roof frame took 3 days. Chestnut uprights, oak ties, hand-notched rafters. Ben passed pegs from his pocket and stayed clear when she lifted the ridge pole. At dusk on the 2nd day, the south tie slipped and knocked a cornerstone loose. The wall shivered. Margaret caught the tie with her shoulder and shouted once. Ben shoved a block under it before fear caught him. When the wall settled, spring water ran brown with silt. They worked by lamp to clear the channel and reset the corner. Supper went cold. Her back went stiff. His knees shook on stone. After midnight, Margaret copied the day's trouble into the ledger. South tie slipped at dusk. Corner reset by lamp. Water muddied 2 pails. Near the end of August, they cut sod for the north berm. Margaret packed earth against the outside wall to block winter wind from that quarter. Ben thought the stone alone looked strong. She said strength and warmth were cousins, not twins. They laid sod grass side down and daubed seams with clay. At 4 o'clock, they set rough roof boards to shade the room until shingles were split. The air over the channel felt colder at once. Margaret smiled a small, quick smile. Next morning, she sent Ben to an abandoned smokehouse for old hinges and square nails. He came back with 1 straight hinge, 1 bent hinge, and a pocket full of rusted fasteners. She had him sort the nails on the table by length. Long, middle, short, bent ones in a tin cup. He liked that job because it ended with a count he could win. 73 usable, 11 bent. She wrote the count in the ledger before supper. That night, she moved the butter crocks into the new room, though the door was not hung yet. Egg baskets went on the dry side. 1 cracked basket sagged and dumped 6 eggs. 3 broke. Ben flinched. Margaret counted what was left and made a birch tally tag for the handle. Egg basket B. 19 sound after dark. She tied it on with twine and wrote it down. September came in dry and bright. Margaret turned a fresh ledger page and drew columns. Clay loads, eggs laid, butter churned, wood cut. Ben asked when the spring house would be finished. Margaret said a thing that holds. Winter is not finished when you are tired of building. It is finished when it stops failing. At mid-morning, Amos came back on foot with a folded paper and a grin. Not a writ. A debt note from Tull, listing Margaret's last purchases and payment due by first snowfall. Amos said he could settle it if she signed the lower strip and spring rights for 2 years. He held the paper just far enough for her to read. The figures were inflated. Lead, priced a penny, higher than the chit. Pass charges added before any delay. Margaret asked if he was taking a commission. His grin answered. Ben said they did not need him. Amos looked at the boy and said, "Boys did not know what winter asks." Margaret stepped between them and said Amos could leave the note or leave his boots in the mud. He dropped the paper on a stone and walked off laughing. After he left, Ben picked up the note with both hands. Margaret flattened it on the bench and tucked it behind the store chit. "No signatures," she said again. Then she handed him the clay pan. By 1:20 after dinner, she hung the spring house door on salvaged hinges from an abandoned smokehouse. The latch side dragged. She shaved the threshold in 3 chisel cuts and tried again. The third try shut true. She stuffed a rag roll at the bottom edge for draft and mouse gap and wrote another proof line. Door hung 1 to 20. Hinge mixed. Latch shaved 3 cuts. Shuts true. A week later, the first cold rain came from the north. The roof held. One back corner dripped. Margaret traced it to a split shingle and changed it before breakfast. At mid-morning, they churned in turns because trade only mattered if they had enough to carry. Cream yield was low. Summer grass had thinned. Margaret measured each crock by finger width from the rim and cut notches on a stick. B1, B2, B3. She hung that stick beside the ledger so she could see losses at a glance. By first light on the next day, she cut a mark on the cabin door frame with her knife. Snow 1. There was no snow yet. Ben laughed and asked why mark an empty frame. She said marks are made before weather, not during. 3 days later, Miss Boone brought news from the ridge trail. A rock slide had narrowed Blacktooth Pass. Not closed, slow, risky. Merchant wagons might wait for a cleaner road. Margaret changed the shelves that same afternoon. 1 for butter, another for eggs, a third for milk pans wrapped in damp cloth. At 4 o'clock, Ben slipped on the wet floor and drove his knee into the threshold. He bit his lip and breathed through his nose. Margaret bent the knee, pressed around the joint, and sat him with a cold rag. No swelling by dusk. She widened the patch on his trouser leg that night and counted stitches while she sewed. 21 on the seam, 9 across the corner. Those counts went in the ledger, too. By late September, mornings stayed colder in the hollow than on the ridge. Mist lingered. The spring water ached her wrist. Margaret moved the best crocks to the rear shelf and wrapped them in wet cloth. Eggs were turned daily. Cracked ones were eaten same day. At before dawn on the 26th, she heard a thin tapping in the spring house. Mouse teeth at the door corner. She took a lamp and found the rag roll chewed through. Ben came barefoot and sleepy and held the light while she nailed a tin strip from an old lard can along the lower edge. 6 short nails, 1 bent. The rest held. She wrote it down before breakfast. Door tin strip set before dawn. 6 nails, 1 bent. Mice kept out. That afternoon, Amos came with 2 men from upriver to make a show of it. One kicked the berm and said it would slump and freeze. The other asked what a woman knew about cold room venting. Margaret opened the door and let them feel the air with their own hands. She pointed to the dry shelf, the flowing channel, and the vent slit. No arguing, only proof. Amos said proof did not pay debt, and Margaret said butter and eggs did if a merchant was honest. At sunset, she checked the woodpile and frowned. The spring house was nearly ready. The wood was not. They split until dark. Ben raised blisters at the base of 2 fingers. Margaret lanced one with a needle, washed it, wrapped it, and wrote another line. Blister right palm, needle, wrapped clean at dusk. October opened with frost on the high grass. Margaret woke Ben before dawn and sent him to the lower ridge to listen for wagons while she churned. He came back at first light with breath showing and said he heard chains far off. Maybe a merchant? Maybe not. She packed 2 butter crocks and 3 egg baskets near the door. She wrapped the ledger in oilcloth with the store papers tucked inside. By 3:40 in the afternoon, no wagon had come. By dusk, she moved everything back into the spring house and re-wet the cloths. A day of readying had made no sail. The next morning, a skim of ice showed in the porch washpan. Ben broke it with one finger and looked worried. Margaret checked the spring house first. The channel still ran black in the middle. No ice skin on the floe. She cut the first true line on the door frame. Snow 1. By mid-morning, a small cart from Trader Reese Monday came up Kettle Run, not Tull. Reese said Tull's wagon had turned back at Blacktooth after another slide and an axle crack. Pass not closed, he said, but near enough for any man with sense. Reese offered to buy Margaret's butter and eggs on Tull's account at a lower rate and settle later. The rate he named would leave them short on salt and with no lead. Margaret brought him into the spring house. She showed him the cold air, the clean crocks, the egg baskets, and the steady channel. Then she opened the ledger. Clay weights, spoil losses prevented, shelf marks, egg tallies. She laid Tull's chit beside it so Reese could see the line about spoil risk. Reese squinted and said, "Old women wrote plenty." Margaret said old women also counted plenty. She named her rate. He laughed once. Then she tipped the largest crock so he could see the hard set and clean color. His laugh stopped. He offered more. Still low. Margaret held quiet. Ben stood by the door with both hands on a basket handle and watched. At last, Reese named a rate below spring prices, but above cheating. Not good. Not ruin. Margaret took it. She made him write a trade chit on the spot before he touched a crock. Received from Monsieur Hale. Butter, 18 pounds by crock count. Eggs, 57 sound. Against goods due. Salt, 10 pounds. Lead, 2 pounds. Lamp oil, 1 tin. Meal balance. Reese signed. Margaret signed slow under him. He left a small sack of salt and half the meal at once and promised the lead and oil on his next run if the road held. When the cart rolled away, Margaret sat on the threshold and pressed her fingers into her eyes. Ben stood still, thinking she might cry. Then she lowered her hands and told him to bring in the empty baskets. Work first, feeling after. The first real snow came on October 12th just after midnight. Wind shoved it under the porch eave. Ben woke to smoke hanging low in the cabin. Margaret was already up with the lamp, checking the flue and the tin patch. The patch held. Draft did not. She cleared ash, opened the flue pin with a knife tip, and fed the fire slow. Smoke lifted by 12:25. She wrote a quick line while the stove caught. Flew poor after midnight in north wind. Draft returned 12:25. By first light, the step was buried past her boot toe. She cut snow, too, on the frame. Ben checked the spring house with strict steps and came back grinning from the cold. Water still ran black in the middle, only a rind at the edge stones. For 3 days, snow held. Past traffic stopped. No wagons. Not even Miss Boone. No Amos yet. Margaret packed fresh clay into hairline cracks that opened in the north berm and braced one settling corner with pegged boards. Visible trouble. Visible fix. A fox took 2 hens on the second night and left feathers by the east rail. That loss cut trade more than supper. Margaret moved the coop closer to the cabin and set a drop bar after dusk. Ben reset the snare twice and caught only cold air. She still wrote the fox loss in the ledger with the flour counts. The ledger filled with shorter winter lines. Meal low. Wood cut 19 sticks. Eggs fewer. Trap empty. Ben coughed once at dawn, then again the next day. Margaret heard every one. A week later, Reese returned on a light sled instead of a cart. He brought the lead shot and a lamp oil tin. He also brought a smaller weight than the chit promised. Margaret reweighed the lead on her tablstones, short by 2 ounces. Reese tried to smile it off. Ben set the ledger on the table without being told. Margaret opened to the trade chit and read the line aloud. Reese watched her finger on each word. Then he reached back into his sack and added the missing shot. He did not smile again. That was the last cheating try that winter. By November, the pass was finally closed. Word came from a man on foot that drifts stood chest high in the cut at Blacktooth. Margaret cut snow 3 on the frame after the first deep storm, and snow 4 a week later, when wind packed the porch hard. Each time Ben stood beside the marks while she cut them. He looked at the older lines first, the way he checked old ledger pages before opening a fresh one. Ben looked toward the ridge and then at the spring house with a new face on him. He no longer asked why she counted. He asked what the count said. Some mornings he opened the ledger and read the date, the weights, and the short notes with his finger under each line. His letters were crooked but growing steadier. Margaret let him copy small entries on scrap. Wood, 14 sticks. Eggs, 9 sound. Berm patch held. One hard morning before dawn, he woke hot and coughing and could not stop. Margaret touched his forehead. Too warm. No fear first. Hands first. She set water to heat, moved his bedding close to the stove, and put broth on. Then she checked the spring house in the dark because trade there had bought the salt and lead and oil that sat ready now. The door opened clean. The channel ran. Butter stayed firm. Eggs stayed cold. By midday, his fever eased. At 4 o'clock, he slept. Margaret sat at the table, sharpened the pencil, and wrote one heavy line. House of Spring held through first closes. Trade saved salt. Lead, oil. Ben warm in bed. She closed the ledger and set it under the lamp. The pencil beside it was worn down to a thumb-length stub. Winter kept counting. The week after, Miss Boone came on a sled with cornmeal and a loaf wrapped in cloth. She asked to see the spring house everyone was talking about. Margaret showed her the vent slit, the threshold lip, the tin strip at the door, the pegged berm brace, and the raised shelves over the channel. Miss Boone laughed soft and said Amos now told folks he would have built one too if he had thought of it. Margaret said thinking late was still thinking. Ben stood in the doorway with a lantern and a patched coat. Miss Boone asked if he still hauled wet clay. He said, "Yes, ma'am," when the berm cracks after thaw. Then he added that Margaret wrote the weight every time. Miss Boone handed him a peppermint for that. By early December, other houses along Kettle Run had bits of Margaret's work in them. Tin at pantry doors, extra vent cuts, earth packed against north walls. No one called it foolish anymore. In one evening near dusk, Amos came without a grin and asked to trade lamp oil for a small crock of butter. His own barrel had leaked. Margaret named a fair rate. He paid it. Before leaving, he touched the stone jam and felt the cold held inside. He said she built it right. Margaret said yes. When he rode off, Ben asked why she traded with him. She said winter is expensive and pride does not burn in a lamp. Later that night, with wind on the roof and snow beginning again, Ben stood by the doorframe and looked at the marks. Snow 1, snow 2, more space waiting below. Then he touched the ledger on the table, asked which mattered more, the marks on wood or the marks on paper. Margaret said both. One showed what the mountain did. The other showed what they did back. He nodded and carried a fresh pan of wet clay to the spring for the berm seam, not because she forced him now, but because he knew what a closed pass cost. If this quiet frontier story stayed with you, please subscribe for more.